everybody. Here we are for chapter 15, second part, 15 section 2. We'll wrap it up today. Still crops and soil, but your essential question: how does genetic engineering improve food crops? So towards the end, we're going to talk about GMOs. But before we get to that, let's take a look at what we have. Now, talking about soil, kind of keying in from yesterday's, we're going to talk about salinization. Salinization is just the accumulation of salts in the soil. Now, this winds up being a problem typically in drier climates, places that tend to have low rainfall, and sometimes the soil is already naturally a little bit salty. Since they don't get much rainfall, you don't get enough rain to kind of wash these salts out and carry them down to the rivers, out to the ocean, etc. So when the water evaporates from the irrigated lands, we irrigate it, the water evaporates and the salts get left behind. And a lot of times, if we keep irrigating and providing fertilizers, the fertilizers add to the amount of salts on the land, and it adds up. Now, salinization can be slowed if the irrigation canals are lined. This prevents the water from seeping into the soil, and also if the soil is watered heavily. Once again, we know how to fix salinization, but it can be expensive. So it's a subsistence farmer, say somewhere in like sub-Saharan Africa, they don't get much rain anyway, so it doesn't get washed out naturally. The water goes on, evaporates, and the soil just gets saltier and saltier. This back here, that's not ice, that's salt on the croplands. And it just builds up, and once again, lots of crops can't grow in salty soil, and then we can't grow anything. So we either have to do something to try and rinse it out, take care of it, or we have to move on to different land. Another problem with crop, soil, things that we need to take care of are pests. Now, worldwide, pests destroy about 1/3 of the world's potential food harvest. It doesn't mean like this whole crop, but you're growing corn and some of the corn winds up, you can't sell it, you can't use it, you have to throw it away because it's been eaten by bugs. Now, a pest is any organism that occurs where it's not wanted. It might be a pest here and it might be wanted over there, depending on what the crop is and what it eats and what eats it. All this kind of food web criteria. It's just we consider a pest when it's eating the food in large enough quantities to actually cause economic damage. Some is going to occur no matter what, but at a certain point, okay, now I'm definitively losing money from it. Now, humans try to control populations of many types of pests. We try and control plants like weeds, right? Certain fungi. Fungus will get into and affect plants, so we can't use them. Insects, obviously, like locusts coming in, eating the corn. And even microorganisms. Sometimes we have single-celled organisms that get in and cause problem for our crops. It ranges all over. So, we come to pesticides. Now, many farmers rely on pesticides in order to protect their crops. Now, a pesticide is any poison that's used to destroy pests. And once again, it can be all of these. Can be insects, that's what we tend to think about. It can be rodents, mice, other things come along. Can be weeds. We tend to talk about insecticides, herbicides. Pesticide is just the overarching term for it. So, once again, you can have insecticides, rodenticides, herbicides. So anyway, but the problem with pesticides is they can also be harmful to people, and they can be harmful to good plants as well as good insects. If insects are out there eating the pest, I don't want to harm those insects. Ladybugs are a classic. Ladybugs eat the aphids, but a lot of times when we spray, it kills the ladybugs and the aphids, and I'm harming both crops and even people. Get it? Over time, spraying large amounts of pesticides to get rid of pests usually makes the pest problem worse, because the insects or the pest, whatever it may be, whether it's a weed or an insect or a microbe, they can develop resistance. This is evolution. I have grasshoppers out in my field, I spray it. Some of the grasshoppers aren't killed by the poison. They have a natural resistance. Well, the grasshoppers left out in my field are having sex with other grasshoppers out in my field, and they're all the ones that survived, and all their babies have the gene for resistance to the chemical I sprayed on my field, and now that chemical doesn't work on my field anymore because I have a field full of genetically evolved superbugs, right? They're resistant to this type of chemical. So more than 500 species of insects currently have developed resistance since 1940. It's just an issue and a problem. Anytime we use chemicals of any kind, we spur evolution along. Anything designed to kill them, if it doesn't kill them all, any of the ones that survive pass their traits on, these genetic traits, and we wind up with bugs that aren't killed by the pesticides. The pesticides are designed to kill organisms, but they can also be dangerous to humans. Usually when you have people spraying pesticides, they're wearing masks, etc., to keep from breathing that stuff in. It's designed to kill the grasshopper or the caterpillar or something else, but obviously breathing large amounts of it in can be harmful. Cancer rates among children in areas where we use large amounts of pesticides tend to be higher than the national average. We just get a correlation. Where we're using a lot of insecticides, we tend to have some higher rates of cancer. It may not be exactly 1-to-1, but it does make us scratch our head when we see these numbers in other places where the rates are a little higher. And people that apply pesticides really need to follow the safety guidelines to protect themselves from contact. Once again, these things are poisoned. Ideally, they're just going to poison the weed or the insect or the rodent that we're after, but humans have to be careful with it. And the problem of pesticides harming people or other organisms is especially serious with pesticides that are persistent. Some of these, we call them persistent pesticides. DDT was a classic. They don't break down easily in the environment. We spray them, a lot of things begin to break down. These are long, complex chains, and sometimes they break apart into their component parts. But some of these pesticides just don't do that. You spray it 10 years later, you can find trace amounts of these pesticides. But since they don't break down, even when something eats it, it remains intact as it goes through the digestive system and it gets eaten and moves up the food chain by that biomagnification that we've looked at before. So these accumulate in the water and the soil. We spray, and then next year we spray again, but they keep accumulating in the soil. They wash into our aquatic systems, and they build up in the waterways. And because of this, some pesticides have been banned in the United States for decades. DDT is one of them. But we still find trace amounts of DDT in the environment. Even though they're banned, we haven't been using them. These persistent pesticides continue to persist and be a problem. And this takes us to biological pest control. When it comes to pest control, we tend to think of spraying with the chemicals. Well, that's fairly modern, if you will. We've only been doing that for 60, 70 years. Biological pest control has been going on since bugs have been on the planet, right? This is where we're using certain organisms to control these pests. Ladybugs. Ladybugs are vicious killers. If you happen to be an aphid, they tell horror stories of ladybugs at night. We think they're cute little insects, but they are carnivores. They're out eating other little insects. So every pest winds up having some sort of enemy in the wild. A locust, still birds are going to eat them. And these enemies are often used to help control populations. If you know you have a particular insect problem, well, can you invite whatever eats it into your area or introduce it into your area, and then you get biological pest control. These include the use of pathogens. It can be microorganisms, plant defenses. We know citronella keeps mosquitoes at bay, so you can grow a citronella plant, keep certain insects away. These chemicals from the plants, we develop some of our pesticides actually just from the oils or something of plants, and the disruption of insect breeding. We can introduce hormones that keep them from breeding so that they reproduce after the crops are gone, cutting down on the problem. So anything that, even sometimes planting our crops at different times of years, can eliminate a lot of the pest problems. Of course, you can't always do that, so there's certain growing seasons. What we're really looking at and trying to move to in many places as we can is what we call integrated pest management. Now, this is a more modern method of controlling pests on the crops. The goal here is not to eliminate the pest populations, because once again, a pest here is actually desirable over there, but to reduce the pest damage to a level that causes minimal economic damage. Once again, if I have a normal biodiversity of life out on my farm, well, they tend to keep each other in check, just the natural checks and balances of the natural world. We usually don't get overrun with mice because we have some cats out there, or owls, or hawks, right? They're all consuming them, keeping them at bay. But if we get rid of all the hawks and cats, well, now we get the mouse problem. We want to keep nature doing what nature does. So what we try to do is institute programs that include a mix of farming methods. So we have some biological pest control going on, and there's some chemical pest control as well. We're just trying to minimize the amount of synthetics we use. It's not that we're getting rid of them entirely, but they're sort of our last resort, and we want to keep them for when we really need them. Okay, a locust swarm does descend. Now we got to break out the big guns, if you will. But if we started with it from the beginning, and then we have resistance, and they're not there to fix a problem at the end. So we typically start with the biological methods. We bring in natural predators, pathogens, parasites of whatever the typical pest we know we're going to have on this crop of food. We use cultivation controls. We can vacuum some of the insects off there. We can pull them out, remove them somewhere else, and even just when we plant our crops. Sometimes we can shift when we begin or when the crops are going to harvest to eliminate the breeding season of certain insects. And then once again, as a last resort, we use the insecticides. But we're also careful to change the type of insecticide we use over time. My dad used to use seven. It's been around forever. I don't know, we were using this stuff back in the 60s. And that's just what he used all the time on his tomato plants. And then after a while, the 7 wasn't really working as well. At the time, I didn't know what it was. Now I realize it was resistance. My dad used the same chemical all the time, and eventually in our yard, the bugs had become resistant to 7 over years and years and years of just using the same chemical. So part of this integrated pest management is we do use chemicals, but we're sure to cycle them around and use different ones, different seasons, so that we cut down on the resistance. And this takes us to genetic engineering. Engineering a better crop. So genetic engineering, a lot of times it's known as GMO, genetically modified organisms. This is technology where we take the genome out of a living cell and we modify it in some shape, form, or fashion for either medical or industrial use. Now in this case, it's kind of industrial use. We're modifying something in the corn or something in the rice or something in the wheat to make it better, either make it bigger, grow faster, or resistant to pests. So we can use genetic engineering to transfer a desirable trait, such as resistant to certain pests, from one organism to another. Citronella, for instance. Insects don't tend to like it. So if we could transmit the gene that produces the part that the pests don't like into corn, then we get a naturally pest-resistant strain of corn. And we're not having to spray pesticides because the corn itself is releasing a toxin to the pest. So any kind of plant that results from this, we just refer to it as a genetically modified plant. So take a look at the graphic back here. This is where we take. So we take a toxin gene and we find a marker gene. We get a bacteria to isolate. We isolate the gene and we put it into a bacteria to move it into the plant. So the two genes are inserted into the corn plant, the toxin from the BT and the marker gene. We then grow those corn cells and expose them to an antibiotic. So only the cells that incorporated the needed genes survive. And that is our genetically modified corn. Now, it doesn't take in everything, but the ones that it does, that's what we pull out. So these surviving cells then grow into the corn plants, and these produce a particular toxin, in this case the Bt toxin, which kills the caterpillar. So the caterpillars, what are coming in and eating the corn? Well, the corn itself produces a toxin that kills the caterpillar. So it's a genetically modified corn. So this genetically modified corn keeps us from having to spray for insecticides because it's the insecticide itself. Now, implications of this. In the United States right now, we eat and use genetically engineered agricultural products every day. The numbers are in the like corn that you eat that's processed, like a corn chip or a tortilla, anything that you get corn from in a bag, like 98% of that is genetically modified. You can get non-genetically modified like fresh corn that you're going by, but most of what's going into packaged material is. Once again, it's in the 90s of soy products. You buy soy milk or soybean in virtually anything. It's been genetically modified. A lot of times for these particular traits so that we don't have to spray for bugs, or it's modified to not die from a herbicide. So we spray everything for weeds and it doesn't kill the corn or the soybean. So you're already eating genetically modified organisms. But a lot of these products haven't really been fully tested for their environmental impacts. And some scientists are concerned that it could cause problems for the future. We've been using them, we know how to do it, we just don't necessarily know sometimes the long-term effects. A while back, DDT was considered perfectly safe. We now know it's not. Sometimes results don't come till much later. I'm not saying our genetically modified fruit is going to cause a problem. It's just there's enough people out there that are concerned and we just don't know. Now let's take a look at this one. This is golden rice. Normally, rice does not have certain vitamins and nutrients in it. In this case, we're adding beta carotene. Beta carotene can help vision. It gives vitamins and minerals in that kids can't get normally, especially in a lot of the Asian countries where they're eating rice and not getting vitamin A. We can get it to them. We get this beta carotene through the rice. So we insert daffodil genes. Daffodil is very yellow, but they produce a lot of beta carotene into the rice. When this rice grows, it has a slightly yellow, golden color, but it provides the beta carotene that rice doesn't normally provide. So we can grow genetically modified rice, and this gets certain vitamins and minerals into the population that wouldn't be able to get it usually. So genetically modified crops can be modified to kind of just help the crop yield so we get more corn per acre. They can also be used to help kids be able to get vitamins and minerals they wouldn't normally get if they're not really truly getting a balanced diet. And this takes us to sustainable agriculture. It's the name of the game. We only have so much land out there that we can grow crops, and we need to grow as much crops on that land as possible. So farming that conserves these natural resources keeps the land productive indefinitely. This is sustainable agriculture. Sustainability is the name of the game in environmental science. We want to be able to grow corn or rice or wheat or soy or whatever it is on that crop for the foreseeable future, indefinitely, right? So, sustainable agriculture is going to involve planting productive, pest-resistant crop varieties that require as little energy, pesticides, fertilizer, and water as possible. And this is what we're after. Sometimes we use natural crossbreeding methods. Other times we're using some genetically modified crops in order to sustain it. But sustainability is the goal. Guys, that wraps it up for really talking about soil today. Take care, and we'll see you next time.